China does not have the lobbying system of the US, which also creates a huge amount of inequity and unfair and unjust outcomes. Chinese government can afford a longer horizon vision in not all, but many aspects of China, the nation's development. They think in 20 years, they think in 30 years, because there's continuity. There's continuity of policy. China's challenge is that it has shifted from the singular goal of economic development encapsulated in GDP growth as a quantifiable number to a broader set of objectives that include social objectives as well as national security objectives. And indeed, that is part of China's challenge today. But I think ultimately it is also a choice and a preference, which could differ from country to country. Now, there's the US, which is great for trailblazing innovation, but scores poorly on inequality and many of these social indicators at various levels. There's Europe, which scores higher on the social aspects, but is not meeting its potential when it comes to wealth creation and innovation. And where does China want to be? Does it want to be more on the US level of decentralized economy and innovation, but with lots of social problems, or does it want to look more like Europe? I think that is also part of China's new playbook, as my book is called, on finding that combination that suits its national characteristics. So I think this is very much ultimately a learning and a path that has to be tread. I'm more of the view that you want to unleash the wealth creation at the individual micro level. And with that wealth, there are better ways, maybe a better political system, maybe a better political mechanism to redistribute in ways that you not end up looking like many of the US problematic aspects. But absent the wealth creation, there's very little to work with, because I think the lesson from the Chinese people in the last 40 years is that they're so grateful to reforms, they're so grateful to economic progress. That's actually what they're most thankful for. And yes, it can create some turbulence along the way, some bumpy path, and some massive wealth gathered in the few individuals. Well, because China is a very large country, and it's almost indicative of meritocracy, where you have a good idea and you become an overnight billionaire. That's achieved by many in China. But how to tackle the unfair aspects of inequality is something they can do. China does not have the lobbying system of the US, which also creates a huge amount of inequity and unfair and unjust outcomes. It can prevent that, but it should not give up the pro-growth agenda, should not give up the huge dream and reality that China is one of the few places in the world where you can actually create massive amounts of wealth. The US is already at some level of steady state, and their improvements are not orders of degrees of magnitude different from the past, but a slow, gradual improvement. And there you debate about policies, the restrictions on what one can do. But finally, I think the one difference really is that Chinese government has a longer vision, or can afford a longer horizon vision in not all, but many aspects of China, the nation's development. They think in 20 years, they think in 30 years, because there's continuity. There's continuity of policy. There's not going to be this pendulum swing and disruptions. And there's not going to be this intention to kind of deliberately change course from the previous government because they're party politics or party competition. There is, on most things, continuity. But if there needed to be a radical change, there is at least political scope to do it. Whether they do it or not is a different matter, but it could be potentially more easily implemented. Sometimes it is an advantage that you can implement strategically important policies without too much political debate and too much political constraint. China is a rapidly changing economy, but it's more subtle than just being able to change policy quickly. It is that they can start a policy or reform or a radical idea, really, in one small place in China. If that fails, then we'll just chuck it. If it actually is successful, then they're gradually, rolled out in 5 provinces, 10 provinces, and then throughout the country. And that was how reform was implemented, and that was how reform was successful. It was not an overnight change, as in the case of many other transitional countries like Eastern Europe, because you didn't know whether these policy would be successful or not, what kind of unexpected consequences they would lead. But China pursued a gradual reform policy development strategy. And even today, we see that when there are important paradigm shifts or that's needed, then they shift once they've made up the mind. And this can, avoid some of the longer traps. The Chinese government has a major dilemma that the US corresponding policymakers do not face, which is in today's circumstances, how can you stimulate growth without blowing up the debt again, right? That's the main challenge. And that's why they're being very deliberate and more careful about the approach, because after 2015, the main objective of the policymakers, central bank, and so forth, is to cool down an economy that's very easily heated up and very difficult to cool down. That was the main objective, and hence the monetary tightening that followed. Today, the main objective is to heat up an economy that is difficult to heat up, but remains very cool. But how can you do that without, again, placing huge amount of debt impositions and challenges on the local government? I think that's why they're being cautious. And the second reason they're being deliberate and cautious is that it's not clear what exactly works most efficiently and most effectively. And there are many different kind of tools. There could be a coordination between fiscal and monetary policy. It could be about the real estate property developers, or it could be about directly stimulating the consumers or service sector. There are really an infinite combination of policy tools. The key question is, how is it going to trickle to the real economy rather than just liquidity kind of being bottled into the financial system and much of that just used to reduce local government debt rather than going into the real economy. I think that's also part of the challenge. And on the conceptual level, there is one big difference, which is that the Chinese government believes that unless you have sustainable wage increases in the long term, the Chinese people will not consume based on a short-term stimulus, like the hand-to-mouth checks in the US, or the short-term kind of what do they call revenge spending, or that kind of phenomenon is not going to pertain to the Chinese people unless they see longer term sustainable changes in the living standards. Now, I still believe that there are ways to get around these challenges, and I do believe that some of the Keynesian effects could work. It's just that the Chinese government and many other governments, actually, apart from the UK and US governments, very few governments are very keen to do large Keynesian type of stimulus, and that's just a mentality difference.